Okay, so for those of you who are visiting, welcome. I see that we have several folks visiting with us this morning. Welcome. Thank you for coming. You really light up the room. But see the joke? I know, it's really sad. All of our lights in here. For those of you who are visiting, we're doing a study this quarter on Sunday mornings about elders. And we're doing the study from what I think, this is a little bit different direction than I've done a study on elders before, because it seems like most of the time whenever we study elders, we'll go to the Timothy and Titus passages and we'll say, what are the qualities that a man must possess? And then we'll talk about the qualities and all of this stuff, and we'll look at those. But I just assume, maybe wrongly, but I don't think so, I assume that most of us know those qualities and know what they're about, and you can read them yourself. I mean, you can read what they say. They're there. What we're doing this time is we're talking about a bigger picture with the elders, and that is who they are and what they do, what that means about their function and their role. And so we have talked about the titles and what that teaches us. So we've said they're called elders. What does that mean? And what do you see in the Bible with the word elders? It means that they're older and wiser and experienced men who hopefully have learned something and demonstrated that they've learned something so that they can navigate the congregation through the landmine field. And so we talked about how they're overseers. And what does that mean that they're overseers? It means that they oversee. They watch over and they lead by their example in all of this. And then we talked about 3 different classes. We talked about shepherds, which is my preferred terminology for this subject. And we talked about Ezekiel and how God has said the shepherds have not done their job, and this is what that looks like, but I'm going to be a shepherd and I'm going to do the job of a shepherd. And so we have a description of what it looks like to shepherd the flock of God's people. And then we talked about John chapter 10, which is the text where Jesus says, I am the good shepherd, and here's what it means to be a good shepherd. And so we talked about those things. This class, I want to start something a little bit different. And I'll just tell you from the very start, I don't know exactly how to do what I want to do. And so you'll have to be flexible with me today. Today, I think, will be mostly an introduction to what I would like to accomplish. And I'll try and tell you as best I can from this illustration, but I think you'll have your own. I think you'll know it. So when I was in the police academy for how long was it? 6 months? For 6 months, almost 6 months, almost the whole time, we would go and it was like school. And we went and we sat down at our tables and we opened our books and there was a teacher and they taught us. And the class was like, here's the Constitution and these are the things that you can't do. And here's our policy and here's the things that you can't do. And the policy book, like the Kansas City, Missouri Police Policy Book, is like one of those 4-inch binders that won't even close on itself. And so the academy was basically, here's the policy and let's talk about this and here are the things that you can't do. And we learned different things. Like one of my favorite sections in that academy was a thing called verbal judo. And the verbal judo is a system out there, and the thing about verbal judo is you learn these patterns of ways to talk and hopefully don't start a fight. That's basically what you're trying to accomplish. And so the verbal judo was always like, okay, so you pull somebody over for speeding and you walk up to the window and you say the exact same thing every time. Morning. You don't say good morning because it's not a good morning for the person being pulled over. You say morning. Morning, my name is Officer Boyd with the Kansas City, Missouri Police Department. The reason why I'm stopping you today, to give them a reason, is because you were driving 55 miles an hour in the 35 mile an hour speed zone over there. I'm not asking any questions because I don't want to hear what you have to say at this point. And so I finish the thing and I say, can I please see your license and registration? And hopefully, if you follow the plan, nobody gets hurt. Those are the things that we learned in the academy, and it's like, okay, let's go through this. And then you finish the academy and have your first night on the street. And it is nothing like what you've done for the last 6 months. Everything is gone. Like, I've sat down at my books for 6 months learning this stuff. And I walk up to somebody's window and I say, evening. And now there's a fight. And it's like, wait a minute, I did everything that I was supposed to do, you know? This is not what was supposed to happen here. How did we get to this spot? I did everything right. And so there is this gap between the book learning and the real life learning that doesn't match. And even in PT with the physical training, it was PTDT, physical training defensive tactics. Even with that stuff, it was, okay, so when you arrest somebody, if they resist, here are the things that you do, and this is the way that you do it, so hopefully nobody gets hurt. And turns out, when you're on the street and Mark says, no, I don't want to be under arrest, I can't say, can you please hand me your wrist because this is how I do an arm bar. You know, it doesn't work like that. What you learn in the books doesn't translate very well to real life and how to handle that stuff. And I think it's true in marriage, right? We all know the right thing to do and how we're supposed to be. But then somebody raises their voice and it all goes out the window. Like everything's different now. You know what I'm saying? Like it all changes. And in an instant, we're in uncharted territory where things are different. And so that's kind of what I would like to at least talk about and think about with this class, because I'm telling you, I don't entirely know how to do this, but I do entirely know that this is something that we need to be thinking about. Our problem as a congregation is not our book knowledge. We've been in the Bible for several weeks now, and we've read the stories, and we know what it says, and we know what our elders are supposed to do, and we know what we're supposed to do, and all of that. That's not our problem. Our problem is real life when things go sideways, and all of a sudden something steps out of the line of the way that it's supposed to be, and now we all say, I'm going to lose my mind, you know, and everybody freaks out. That's where our problem comes. And what I'd like to do today is just illustrate, I think. I don't have a PowerPoint because I want to talk about some of these things with you all. And hopefully after we illustrate it with some examples with Moses and Israel coming out of Egypt, hopefully we can spend next Sunday morning trying to talk about real life. Like, that's the only way that I know how to convey what I'm trying to accomplish in this right now. I don't want to talk about book knowledge. I want to talk about real life and what happens when things go sideways, and how we can take the book knowledge and apply that to what we need to do. So let me give you the first illustration. Look at Exodus chapter 3. Exodus chapter 3 and verse 7. The Lord said, I have surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt, and have heard their cry because of their taskmasters. I know their suffering. In verse 10, this is what God says to Moses that he's going to do. I will send you to Pharaoh that you will bring my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt. And Moses goes through this series of steps where he ultimately says, I don't want to do that thing that you're telling me to do. He tries to get out of it, the excuses. Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh? And God says, well, here you go. And he says, what if they say, what is his name? God says, this is my name. This is what you tell them. Chapter 4 and verse 1, they're not going to believe me or listen to me. And God says, okay, well then this is what you're going to do to convince them that it's real. In verse 10, he says, I'm not eloquent. I'm not going to be a good speaker or a good leader, and they won't listen to me or follow me. And God says, okay, well here's how we'll fix that problem. And then in chapter 4 and verse 13, Moses says, please just send someone else. Please don't make me do this thing that you're asking me to do right now. And God, it gets angry about it. It says the anger of the Lord was kindled against Moses, but he still answers his concern. And so Moses goes to Israel. And so this is where it starts in chapter 4 in verses 30 and 31. This is what I want you, this is where I want you to start paying attention. In my Bible, I tell you about how I mark things every once in a while. Green is good and red is bad. These verses are green because this is good. Israel does what they're supposed to do here. Aaron spoke all the words that the Lord had spoken to Moses and did the signs in the sight of the people, 31. And the people believed, and when they heard that the Lord had visited the people of Israel and that he had seen their affliction, they bowed their heads and they worshiped. No problems yet. Everything is the way that it's supposed to be right now. And this is where we start our conversation. Can somebody please read chapter 5 for us, nice and loud, and read verses 15 to 23. And I'll tell you the question that I'm going to ask as soon as we're finished with this. 5:15 to 23 is the breakdown. And what I want us to do is a situation analysis on the breakdown. What went wrong? Where did people mess up? What should they have done instead? How can we learn from this situation? What can we learn from this situation? So you're reading it and you're thinking, okay, what are the problems? What are the good things? Read that for us, please. Exodus 5:15 to 23.
The foreman of the people of Israel came and cried to Pharaoh, why do you treat your servants like this? No straw is given to your servants, yet they say to us, make bricks. Behold, your servants are beaten, but the fault is in your own people. And he said, you are idle, you are idle. That is why you say, let us go and sacrifice to the Lord. Go now and work. No straw will be given you, but still deliver the same number of bricks. The foreman of the people of Israel saw that they were in trouble when they said, you shall by no means reduce your number of bricks, your daily task each day. They met Moses and Aaron, who were waiting for them, as they came out from Pharaoh, and they said to them, the Lord look on you and judge, because you have made us stink in the sight of Pharaoh and his servants, and have put a sword in their hand to kill us. Then Moses turned to the Lord and said, O Lord, why have you done evil to this people? Why did you ever send me? For since I came to Pharaoh to speak in your name, he has done evil to this people, and you have not delivered your people at all.
All right. I'm done talking. It's your turn now. Situation analysis. What happened? Yeah, Luke? What did you say? I heard Pharaoh did what?
He gave them an unreasonable request.
Okay. Okay, so just in the thinking process here on this whole thing, is the problem at this point with God? No. Is the problem at this point with Israel? No. God said, I'm going to deliver you. This is fine. The problem at this point is some outside force that is not doing what it's supposed to do according to the plan. Well, at least according to what Israel thinks the plan is at this point. So we have Pharaoh acts badly. The way that I summarize this point in yes, you can read it and you can say, here's the problem, no straw will be given to the people of Israel. But verse 19 gives us a word to use as a summary for the problem here. He says, then the foreman of the people of Israel saw that they were in trouble. The problem is that we have trouble. Is that fair? I mean, I'm asking a genuine question. You look like you're thinking through it with me. Does that sound like it's fair? Or other thoughts about the trouble? So what happens? Read through the story. I'll give you some time just to think it through. Ed? Okay. So our first response when there's trouble from the outside, the problem is not God, the problem is not Moses, the problem is not Israel, the problem is Pharaoh on the outside. The first response of the people of Israel is to point to Moses and say in verse 21, the Lord look on you and judge, because you have made us stink in the sight of Pharaoh and his servants, and have put a sword in their hand to kill us. So their first reaction, I think this is why we're here. This is what I want us to appreciate. And this is not a story in the Bible. This is human life and real experience. Our first reaction at any sight of trouble is to turn to the leader and say, this is your fault. Why have you done this to us? It's just an observation. Like, I'm not ready to, maybe you are. You can say something about that if you would like. You can turn it into practical. Oh yeah, that reminds me of this one time. I'm just trying to learn about human experience and what happens when things go wrong. It seems like Israel lost their mind and fell apart when things got a little shaky. That's our trouble here.
But they went inconsistent. So you said Israel wasn't the problem. To an extent, Israel was the problem. Because in chapter 4, they said, this is awesome, God's going to let us out, God's going to let us go. And they bowed their heads and worshiped at the end of chapter 4. And then there is an impediment to that. And all of a sudden that goes out the window.
Yeah. And then, so to start off, Israel is not the problem to this point. But here's what happens, and this is why I'm talking about this, and this is what I want us to avoid. Israel becomes the problem because they respond poorly to a stressful situation. And that's what we're going to do. We're just going to think about that all day, because our problem as a congregation is not that we don't know what this says. We know what it says. We've talked about it. For years we've talked about it. And for maybe some of your entire Christian lives, you've read these passages and you know what it says. The problem is not that we don't know what it says. The problem is that when stress comes, some of us respond poorly to that stress and everything falls apart. I mean, I'm willing to hear if you think that's not a fair assessment. But I think, and it's going to be a hard conversation to have, because how do you train for stress in a congregational environment? I mean, if we're going to do practice, you don't just go to the range and shoot at a target. First, you have to run 3 miles and get yourself all worked up and get your heart rate up and get yourself all shaky. And then whenever you come back, somebody's going to scream in your face and say, go hit that target. And if you fail to hit the target, you're going to lose your job forever and you're not going to be able to feed your family. And all of a sudden it's like, this isn't what I'm trying to do. It's like, so how do we do that? How do we train for what we know is going to be the problem? How do we get ourselves ready for that, other than to read it and to think it through? What else do you see? Just keep reading it over and over again. The longer you read it, the more you see. Yeah, Kevin?
And then you said this is like how we actually feel. So the people blame Moses, and then Moses first blames himself too. So Moses blames Moses. The people blame Moses, and then Moses says, "Why did you send me, God?" And so like he's partly blaming himself, and then he goes on down the line and then blames God. Like, you asked us to do this, and now it's God's fault. And then what I was seeing is that we did read, but chapter 6, verse 1, God redirects their focus to what was actually going on. That now you will see. And it reminded me of John chapter 9, when there's a man born blind and they pass by him. And the disciples say, who sinned, this guy or his parents? And he's like, no, it's neither of those things, so that you will see God. And so, like, it seems like the answer to that is redirect our focus. It wasn't, the goal of it was to see and know God, not to keep pointing fingers and cast blame on down the line.
Yeah. I really like that, redirect your focus. And maybe, you know what? If we're going to talk about elders in Ephesians 4 as shepherd teachers, maybe that's one of our major takeaways from this study. And what we think is, when everything starts to go sideways and fall apart, the shepherd is the one who says, hey, everybody, let's remember what we're doing here. And we'll see what Moses says to Israel later on about, remember where to put your faith, remember where to put your trust, remember where to put your hope, and all that. All good and fine until the pulse increases. It's just, I don't know how to say it other than to say, let's think about it now when we're sane, rather than waiting until the moment when we're not. So look at this, Kevin. You said this thing too in verses 22 and 23. I do want us to think about this real quick. Moses turned to the Lord and said, "Oh Lord, why have you done this?" Does that sound familiar to anybody? The very first thing that Israel does is points at Moses and says, "You created this situation." And then Moses goes to God and he says, "Why have you done this?" Does that remind you of anything? Does it sound like anything familiar? Yeah. It's like, and that is the prototype of all sin, and what falling away from God looks like is our immediate first reaction is to point the finger and blame. Did you eat the fruit? The woman who you gave me. Okay, let's ask the woman. It was the serpent. He did it. And we see that this is our humanity, my response. When something goes bad, I think this is what you write down on your notes. I don't have a PowerPoint where it's organized, but if you're starting to write bullet points and you're starting to try and say, okay, what can I learn from this about when my pulse increases and we get ourselves into a stressful situation? Number one, don't immediately look for someone to blame. Right? We've got a problem. The problem is that we have to make more bricks than we're able to make right now. And probably our first response should not be, who are we going to blame for this problem? I just sinned and ruined all of God's perfect creation. Probably the appropriate first response is not, whose fault can I make this? Just thinking out loud here, what do you think? Doesn't that kind of work out in marriage too?
And at work. I know, like on a sales team, when they raise your quota, people that are in sales freak out and want to blame your manager, but a lot of times your manager had no bearing on that. They were just the ones to deliver the news. It was the directors 3 steps ahead of them who determined the quota. So I think it is in human nature to want to blame someone or want to hate somebody for a change or whatever scares you. So it's not just like in families and marriage, but definitely in the workplace too.
Yeah.
Maybe it's in all relationships.
I think that's what we're talking about here is humanity. And what's crazy about this, and I take a huge chunk of responsibility for this, what's crazy about this is we can spend all the time that we need to spend in the Bible talking about what we're supposed to do, but you know good and well that At some point, we're going to fail. And how about we plan to fail? And I don't mean we plan to fail. We say, okay, when we fail, when things go sideways, what are we going to do to not make it worse? That's the goal of this. Maria, you had something back there.
It's kind of similar to what Morgan was talking about, just this whole aspect of how our typical reaction to a lot of things in life, especially when we perceive them to be not positive, is to want to blame someone, is to react in fear. And, I think most of the time we have problems. Sin has consequences, whether it's back to the Garden of Eden or something more immediate in each other's lives. And instead of trying to, blame others or react negative, we're not doing what God has told us to do.
Yeah.
And that's always the problem.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not that, we know this book so well, and there's just pieces we don't know when it comes to how to react to stress or problems. No, we do know. We just choose not to, myself included, we just choose not to take those stressful situations or those negative situations and handle them the way God has prescribed.
Yeah.
And that's always the problem, is we want to, especially when it comes to stressful situations, we think we know better.
Yeah. Yeah. It's not. The problem is a bad reaction. So I got a couple things on my list here. We've talked about most of them, but I'll just go through my list. Number 1 in verse 19, there's trouble. Verse 21, they blame. Also in verse 21, it seems like this is one of the main symptoms of our problem here. The Lord look on you, Israel to Moses, the Lord look on you and judge, because you have made us stink in the sight of Pharaoh and his servants, and have put a sword in their hand to kill us. They forgot who the enemy was. They forgot what they were doing and who they were fighting, and instead of fulfilling their mission and working together against their common enemy, they turned on each other instead. Boy, that's something we see, don't we? That's just a part of normal reaction. And so we see they forgot who the enemy was. In verse 22, you see more blame. Moses blames. Moses turned to the Lord and said, "Oh Lord, why have you done evil to this people? Why did you ever send me?" And then in verse 23, "For since I came to Pharaoh to speak in your name, he has done evil to this people. And you have not delivered your people at all." He forgot God's promise. God said, "I'm going to save my people." And Moses said, "Well, you haven't saved us." And this is just one of those spots, since we're in Galatians and we've talked about in the last Wednesday night about Abraham. Here is Abraham, an old man, and his wife is an old woman past the years of childbearing. And he says, "God, you made this great promise to me that I'm going to have a great big family, but I don't have any kids." And God says, "You will have kids." And 15 in verse 6, Genesis 15:6 says, Abraham believed God, and that's the thing that caused God to count him as righteous. And so Moses lost sight of the promise. I'm going to save you, my people. And under the stress, he forgot and said, "Where is it?" When a better response would be Abraham's response to say, "Okay, this really stinks right now, but I believe you." Because that's the thing that counts a person as righteous, that causes God to count a person as righteous. There's 4 quick things from this situation. Anything else you want to talk about before we move to the next one? Yep, Maria?
Well, when you're operating out of fear or some kind of stress like that, it inhibits your ability to think rationally, to think logically, or in God's terms, to use wisdom. And so I think that's one of the things why God, regularly warns us to not be fearful, not because he just wants to put this positive spin on things and everything's just happy-go-lucky. I mean, that's all great, because, it's because he knows it's going to prevent us ultimately from doing his will.
Yeah.
And from, operating in a way that's going to allow us to handle things the way he wants us to handle them.
Yeah.
And again, it's not because he's a control freak, but because he loves us and he put those things in place because he knows that's going to work it out for our good.
Yeah. Here is God who has a plan and knows everything, and my job is not to tell him how to do his plan. My job is to trust him. That's my job. Okay, next, somebody, would you read Exodus 6 and verses 6 through 13? There's maybe not a whole lot of itemized points in this one that we're going to take away other than to just see more of the stress that creates the trouble. So, Exodus 6, 6 through 13, please.
Say therefore to the people of Israel, I am the Lord, and I will bring you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians, and I will deliver you from slavery to them, and I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and with great acts of judgment. I will take you to be my people, and I will be your God. And you shall know that I am the Lord your God, who has brought you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians. I will bring you into the land that I swore to give to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. I will give it to you for a possession, or I will give it to you for a possession. I am the Lord. Moses spoke thus to the people of Israel, but they did not listen to Moses because of their broken spirit and harsh slavery. So the Lord said to Moses, Go in, tell Pharaoh, king of Egypt, to let the people of Israel go out of his land. But Moses said to the Lord, Behold, the people of Israel have not listened to me. How then shall Pharaoh listen to me? For I am of uncircumcised lips. But the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron and gave them a charge about the people of Israel and about Pharaoh, king of Egypt, to bring the people of Israel out of the land of Egypt.
Okay. Observations. What do you see there? Yeah, Stacy?
Well, the problem all along is essentially they had conditioned themselves to think that a life of bondage to another nation was okay.
The condition themselves.
Conditioned themselves to think that a life of bondage to another nation was okay. That in that position, they could still please God and they could call out to God. They conditioned themselves to think that it was okay to slip, little by little, well, here's a big slip, into something that God told them they should never do. And that's never okay. It's never okay to think a little bit of sinfulness I don't have to worry about. I can live with that. I can live in that state. And that's what they've done. They had given a promise. Here's your land. Here's your nation. It's going to be great. And they let that go as they went into bondage instead of finding out the Lord right from the start and not going into that position in the beginning, in the first place. So now they're going to deal with this playing the blame game and all these little things that they're going to get into because they've lost the understanding that the life of bondage is not acceptable.
Yeah.
Start.
There's not a whole lot in the Bible about this. I can only think of 2 passages. I've looked, but I can only think of 2 passages that explain or tell us anything at all about what Israel was doing while they were in Egypt. And it seems as if they were worshiping Egyptian gods the whole time. So here it's not just bondage and slavery. They're not living the way they should be living. And so God says, hey, come out of that. And it's like an impossible task to pull people out of that. How do you do that to someone? Did somebody? No. Okay. Dave, yeah.
I see a parallel here with what happens later with Elijah and the prophets of Baal. There's moves and counter moves, and who really has the power. And God's people, or the Israelites, I guess you could say. But they're sure. They're, like you said, they're lacking trust, and God is now presenting them, because they're at the right state of mind now to seek out help. And God's, in essence, helping them to have faith and giving them an opportunity to trust Him, even in what would seem to be their most extreme state of needing to have trust. So they're at the rock bottom. They've got no other way to turn. They can only complain as their outlet.
Yeah.
So God is now preparing to show Pharaoh, who feels like he's in the power, and show Israel, who feels like Pharaoh's in the power, and their gods are in the power, and even Moses, whose trust and faith is being stretched in all this.
So, in verse 6, say therefore to the people of Israel, I am the Lord, and I will bring you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians. They're stressed because of the burdens and the trouble. And this is what Kevin's point was earlier, I think, is God redirecting the people back to what their ultimate thing is. And on that point, I think about the promise that God made to Abraham. I've got a little thing here next to Genesis chapter 12 and the promise that God made to Abraham of, I don't want to say all because it's always possible that I miss some, but these are the other times when God reaffirms and restates that promise to Abraham through the book of Genesis. It's in Genesis 12, Genesis 13, Genesis 15, Genesis 17, Genesis 22, Genesis 26, Genesis 28, and Genesis 27. And so God knows this promise that He made, and He knows that it's hard for us to understand that this is an extremely long game and God's working His plan. And the way that God addresses that is to say, let me remind you, let me remind you, let me remind you, let me remind you, over and over again. And so here He is reminding them, I will bring you out from under these burdens. But the people are just not having it. They can't. It's like they can't. They physically cannot trust God here. In verse 9, the Lord spoke thus to the people of Israel. This isn't read in my Bible. But they did not listen to Moses because of their broken spirit and their harsh slavery. And that's why we're here today. That's the thing. Because I promise you, I can make this promise. At some point in our church's existence, at some point, we're going to have elders, and at some point, we're going to have problems. And I can almost promise you how those problems are going to happen. It's not because I or somebody else stand up and say, you don't need to be baptized in order to be saved. And it's like, well, he said something that's not true according to the Bible, and we need to talk about that. That's just not what happens. That's not what happens. What happened is, Mark says something mean to Dave, and Dave gets offended about it, and we got to tussle it through and all of this. And that's the problem. They didn't listen to Moses. Why? Because of their broken spirit and because of their harsh slavery. They respond poorly to the circumstances, and everything breaks down. One more thing that I want to say about this one before we move on. And this is just about as practical a thing as I think I can find. God says in verse 10 to Moses, go and tell Pharaoh that we're leaving. And what is Moses' response to God's command to go and tell Pharaoh?
People won't listen to me. What makes you think Pharaoh's going to listen?
Exactly. I came to my own people to tell them God's going to save you. And they all said, yes, let's go be saved. And then they turned away and blamed him and won't listen to him. And they have a little uprising against him. And God says, go talk to the big bad enemy over there. And Moses is like, well, my own family won't listen to me. Why would he listen to me when I go out there? Do you see any sorts of applications for us in what we can learn about our poor responses to stress situations from that example? Where is one of the biggest places where the gospel is going to suffer? When we react poorly to stressful situations. Yeah, Maria? Oh, Lisa? Let's do Lisa.
Constantly, while you've been talking, I've been thinking, if we don't choose to examine ourselves daily, and many, many days can go by without that happening, without months, there's no way we can make this work with the Lord. Because it starts with us as individuals, not us as a group.
Yeah. You want to fix the group? You want to fix the world? Fix yourself. Ask God to fix you. It's all that we can do. So, you got something there? You're scratching your head. It's a nice looking head. I think about this one all the time. You know, here we've got a situation where our congregation reacts poorly under a stressful situation, and we turn in on each other, and we blame our leaders, and we forget what we're really doing right here. All the while, we're supposed to be out there telling the lost world about Jesus. And has it ever crossed your mind, why would I invite somebody to come in and be a part of this chaos? Why would I do that? Like we can't even figure it out. What am I going to offer them out there? Here's your incentive, if nothing else. Dave's point made me think about this. We have to have an outlet. Here's your incentive to just not talk when you feel like you're going to pop. And it works in marriage too. I just got to say something. No, you don't. You don't. I promise. I've learned this the hard way. I was in a marriage counseling class one time, and the guy was saying, we all want to talk about communication. Let's talk about communication in marriage, and what we need is better communication in marriage. And the teacher who was leading this class said, some of the best advice that I can give about communication in marriage is that sometimes it's best to just not communicate. Just keep your mouth shut. Because the bad reaction under a stressful situation, especially if it's blame and taking off of our goal and doing all of this stuff that we've been talking about this morning, it's only going to make things worse. Maria?
I was going to say there's something called nonverbal communication also that can work wonders.
Oh, yeah.
That's just... I'm not talking about the negative. To piggyback off what you were saying about keeping your mouth shut.
Yeah.
And that's what I'm labeling that as, a lot of times it's better just to stay quiet, nonverbal, and just let things rest for a while.
Yeah. So here's what I want to do. The bell rang. I got one more example in Exodus 14 that we're going to look at. And that's going to lead us in next Sunday to, you know good and well that I'm not really going to do this. I can't. I'm not capable of just coming to class with no notes or preparation or direction or something like this. But what I would like for us to do is to spend next Sunday morning in class talking about, let's make this real. Let's think about our situations. I will open up to you and I will tell you about my poor reactions in the past and how those poor reactions contributed to disarray. You're welcome to do the same, but I at least, if we know that this is going to be our problem in the future, I at least want to spend one class thinking about it and talking about it so that we can finish up and say, let's not do that thing. Do not do that thing whenever you get yourself under stress, when we find ourselves under stress. Okay, thanks for your communication this morning, and I'll look forward to hearing what you come up with next Sunday morning.